Now, this is our third hour lecture that we have just written, even though we have not finished what we started in the second hour. I just want to put you down to where we were. We have seen the fifth period about Jesus' life, which is the third Passover to the final week. We have seen this last Passover week, the crucifixion of Jesus, and then also the seventh period of Jesus' life, which Mike has given us. A life of Jesus is about the resurrection, the ascension of Jesus Christ, like I mentioned. And I said that aside from the ascension, these are the people about about 10 separate appearances to more than 540 people in the space of 40 days that Jesus really met. This will be quite significant proof of his resurrection compared to any other prophet or any other history about Jesus Christ. And I try to understand, I say that at the end of his ministry, his life and the work of Jesus Christ will become meaningful and more real to our present days if we really understand the existence and the purpose of Jesus coming to this earth. Now, it takes us now to the conclusion of this lesson one um, by Mike, which it talks about the conclusion in this. Generally, he tried to give us what we have found in the conclusion of his introduction. Now, people will say introduction is not that important, but let me assure you that in an introduction of a lecture, it's very important because it gives you the key background and foundation of everything that one wishes to do. Now, the first conclusion lesson that he tried to give us, if you still remember, was there was a method based on his movement that he performed. One, in the northern part, he tried to describe all these conclusion lesson based on areas and why they are so important. One of the area he talks about the method that was based on this is that from the north, his early life at home, from the north with his family. Now, Jesus Christ was born and he was able to manage between his life and the north part of it, where he tried to portray his present life. And the south, that announcement of his ministry in the capital city in the south, where John was and some leaders, another majority of the populations of the ministry situated. This is where it shows the significance of Jesus' ministry. The northern part again, when he talks about the returning to the north to actually begin his actual teaching ministry and miracles for his own family and reconciliation, recruiting his neighbor as his own disciples for the ministry. I think Mike talks something important here, that Jesus' disciples were all from his area. So it's either they knew him and they grew with him, but they never knew and believed exactly or accepted his position as the Messiah, as the King of Kings, as whoever he want to be. So it means becoming an effective leader or minister in your environment. You only need your people who know you, who are aware of you, are very familiar with you, that can be able to work with you in such a situation. Now, the life of Jesus Christ was practically within his people. So his disciples were his people who knew him growing and could stand by him. they actually know him, because when they don't know him, it's difficult for them to accept exactly who he was and who he could be and what actually he could do. So the also sad issue is that there was a returning to Jerusalem to plan for his ministry. Up and down, where he was rejected, where he was denied, he went up and down and come back. He spent all his time in the east pattern and the north and the west, spending most of his time from the north to the east and back to the north, while taunted with their lives by the leaders of the council. He was forced to do things that he was not willing. He has to go back and come back because he really wants to face the ministry. This really makes sense when you expand your ministry from different angles of life. The southern part, which is then his final appearance to Jerusalem Council, which resulted to his final death, and the establishment of his church began in Jerusalem down to the north. His movements were based on the prophecy. Remember, when we talk about the life of Jesus Christ, we provided the proof of life of Jesus Christ, which began from his prophecy and his testimony by himself as he is who he is. And these are some of the prophecy that was mentioned in Micah chapter 5 verse 2 in Bethlehem, where he was born, and in Matthew chapter 2 verse 23 down to verse chapter 5 and older, you see about the life of Jesus, where he was raised in Nazareth. Jesus' ministry was not based randomly, but was based on the method. So if you want to enjoy exactly what Jesus' life is all about, we must understand him in his basis environment, his life completely to what it has to be in his life. Now, he mentioned something about the smaller aspect of Jesus' ministry area. But even though he was in a small area of his ministry, but his great ministry became impact. Jesus came at the time from the small area but expanded it by his wonderful life. You can see that in Jesus' ministry, so many things happened, and the lives were touched unto this glory. When Jesus instructed the elders in the temple at the age of 12, he declares that this is his Father's house, and it is his duty to carry out his Father's business. Immediately after this, we are told that he returned to Mary and Joseph's home and was obedient to them. You can see his life of Christ. Christ's life as a divine was done, and at the same time the life as his personal life in which he was human was there, all to the obedience of his parent. Another term used is the King of Kings or the Lord of Lords of hosts. Other names were used by Christians include Ancients of Days, Father Abraham, which all talks about Jesus' life. Now, this is not what we are talking about, but we are talking about Jesus' ministry that has becoming a what? A method. It has a method in which Jesus' ministry and life was also taken about. From this angle, we will like to go to the second part of the lecture, which is about the childhood of Jesus Christ, or the boyhood of Jesus Christ, his ministry.
Luke and John talk about this in both of their first chapters. Luke's gospel is the only one that implies that it was written as a letter, and so the introduction explains the reason for the letter. All the others don't explain why they're writing. Luke's gospel is the most historical in nature and contains the most details. 119 of the total 186 events are described in Luke. So if you're looking for a history, Luke, and you're only going to read one book, Luke is the one to read. On the other hand, John, it's not an introduction, it's a prologue. In the beginning was the Word. John announces the theme of his gospel, not why he wrote it, but the theme of his gospel. Different from Luke in that it isn't a letter. Different from the others in that Matthew and Mark begin by telling the story from the very beginning of their books. But John's first 18 verses summarizes the life and the purpose of Jesus Christ and defines his nature and source from the very outset of the book. And then in verse 19, he goes on to tell the story beginning with John's preaching. So he starts with John's preaching. And so you have two introductions, one in Luke, one in John. That's the first event. Second event, the genealogies. Genealogies are contained in Matthew and in Luke. Now, before any action or personalities are introduced, the genealogy of Jesus is given in order to establish several things. First of all, the genealogies are given to establish his place within the Jewish community. I mean, you were a Jew because you belonged to the nation. And your place in the nation was confirmed and maintained in the records of the families and their descendants. They had written records, written genealogies that were kept. That's how you proved who you were, if you were in the priestly line or the Levitical line, or whether you were, which tribe you were in, land rights. All of these things were resolved because your name was part of the genealogy. You could trace your family through these genealogies. So, the first genealogy establishes Jesus within the Jewish community. The second reason is it establishes his direct relationship to David, King David. Prophets told that the Messiah would be a descendant of David of the tribe of Judah. So anyone claiming to be the Messiah, and there were many, anyone claiming to be the Messiah would have to be within this lineage, would have to prove that they belonged to that lineage. So Matthew's genealogy describes Jesus' royal genealogy, tracing it from Abraham to David to Joseph, and thus his legal authority to claim the title of Messiah. Luke describes his natural descendants from Adam. They're different because the authors choose different people on the list of descendants to mention in order to make their case. They don't mention every single person in the line of descendants. For example, if from Adam to Joseph there were 300 descendants, well, each author mentions different ones in that lineage. Okay? For example, Matthew starts with Abraham, and then he mentions the 103rd descendant, the 107th descendant, the 208th descendant, the 286th descendant, so on and so forth. And then he gets to the final one, 300, he gets to Joseph. Luke does it exactly in reverse. He starts with Joseph, the 300th, the third, the last one down, and then he mentions the 297th one, the 295th one, the 284th one, and he works his way back, but he goes all the way back to Adam. So genealogies are there to show that Jesus was a Jew, and also that he had a legitimate claim to the role of Messiah, according to the prophets who said that the Messiah would come through David's lineage. So that's why you have those genealogies there. They're for us because we study the prophets, but for the Jews at that time, they would first and foremost look at those things to establish his basic credibility. One thing that's interesting is that after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, all the genealogical records were destroyed. The Romans not only destroyed the temple and the city and the wall and everything down, they also burned all of the genealogical records. There are no genealogical records left. Huh? Well, except this one. That was my last point. Thank you. Except this genealogical record. The only one that actually is kept is here in the New Testament, the one for Jesus. So some people say, well, you know, the Jews will try to reestablish the temple and so on and so forth. They can't do it. Why? That's good. Everybody answers at the same time. That's good. Somebody? Yes. They don't have the records. How can you prove you're a priest? How can you prove that you belong to that line? When I was in Israel, back in 2000, our guide, Itzhak, and I we went back and forth. We were together for 10 days. So finally I said, so Itzhak, I said, what tribe are you from, Oh, I'm from the tribe of Judah. Really? I said, and how do you know that? He says, oral tradition. And he was dead serious. Oral tradition. Okay, anyways. Number 3, the third event, birth of John the Baptist, is announced. Only in Luke. And we know the story, a priest named Zacharias married to a woman named Elizabeth, who is the cousin, they say kinsman, but cousin of Mary of Nazareth. And he's chosen by lot, it says. Chosen by lot. And this was a once-in-a-lifetime privilege. Chosen by lot to go burn incense in the holy place. The holy place was the anteroom before the Holy of Holies. And they would burn incense on the altar there, on the table there. I mean, there were a lot of priests, there were a lot of people who fit that category, so they couldn't all do it all the time. So if your name was drawn by lot, wow, it's like hitting a jackpot, that was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And so Zechariah goes and does his duty, his priestly duty. And while doing this, an angel appears to tell him that his wife will have a son. She has been barren, not able to have children, and now she's past childbearing age. And we know the story. He doubts, and he's struck dumb until the child is born. 4th event, the birth of Jesus is announced. Luke 1:26-38. Like I said, Luke has a lot of historical information. So 6 months after John's birth is announced, so is Jesus' birth announced. But this time to the woman who would bear the child herself, and that is Mary. Notice, John's birth is announced to his father first. Jesus' birth is announced to his actual mother. And the angel tells her that unlike John, who would be great in the sight of the Lord and a perpetual Nazirite, meant that he'd taken a vow, no alcohol, no meat. He would be a servant of God, that's why he was a Nazirite. And he would be filled with the Holy Spirit. That was who John was. Mary's son would be conceived by supernatural means on a completely different plane. And he would be the long-awaited Messiah. And both would have missions. One would prepare the way for the other. One would announce and introduce, and the other would fulfill all that was said about the Messiah in prophecy. 5th event, Mary visits Elizabeth. Luke 1:39. These are easy because they're all in Luke. So if you read Luke, the sequence is pretty easy. Now, in the last 3 months of Elizabeth's pregnancy and during the first 3 months of her own, Mary visits her elderly cousin and assists her in the final months of her pregnancy. When they meet, Mary pronounces a beautiful poem. The Bible doesn't call it this, but scholars have referred to it as the Magnificat. And in the poem, she praises God for his goodness to her, the fact that she has the honor of being the mother of the Messiah. Praises him for his kindness to all who fear him, his help to those who are oppressed, sending the Messiah, and her peace and her joy at her condition. And the interesting thing about this poem in Luke is that it's completely consists of Old Testament scripture. It's not that she's inspired to say something new that has never been said before. She simply, I won't say simply, but the amazing thing about it is the entire poem is simply one Old Testament scripture after another, which suggests that Mary knew the scriptures. She knew them well. A holy woman of God indeed. Number 6, the birth of John the Baptist. Luke 1:57-80. John is born soon after Mary's departure, and his name is given as John. A surprise, because no one in Zacharias' family has this name. And usually at that time, included a name of a relative. That's why in the genealogies, the same names come back over and over and over again, because they would name their children, grandchildren the same, with the same name. When he does, he begins to praise God. And he too, with references from the Old Testament. I'm going quickly here because this is familiar stuff. Number 7, the angel appears to Joseph. That's the 7th event in sequence. Matthew chapter 1, verse 18 to 25. So Matthew tells the story from Joseph's perspective, and Luke tells the story from Mary's perspective. That's the difference. Okay? So they were betrothed, meaning that the dowry was set. The families got together, agreed on a dowry. The dowry had been set, had been paid for. The commitment to marry was done. The house was chosen. All that was left was the wedding feast. And the wedding feast was usually 1 year after the official betrothal. So the idea was the dowry was set, the families would meet, the betrothal was made public. Roughly a year later, the couple would have a wedding feast, and from the wedding feast, they'd move straight into their home. The betrothal was a binding agreement. If you wanted to break the betrothal, you had to get a legal divorce. You had to put someone away legally. Even though the couple had not, quote, consummated their marriage, they hadn't lived together, slept together, or anything like that, nevertheless, they were considered betrothed, promised to one another. Now, let's see. Now, before the wedding feast, of course, we know the story. Mary is pregnant by the Holy Spirit. Now, some people doubt this. They deny it using several arguments. And you've heard these arguments from agnostics and others. They say that this part was added later on, by unknown and uninspired writers. Or they claim that virgin birth was not held by the early church because the epistles don't write about it. And it's true, if you read the epistles, none of the writers in the epistles refer necessarily to the virgin birth. And some say, well, it's just impossible naturally. In other words, they don't believe in miracles, so they deny the idea of the virgin birth. Of course, the answer to this is that both Matthew and Luke both mention quite specifically the fact that Mary conceived in a miraculous fashion. So, if we're going to choose, I'm going to go with the gospel writers first, not with the 20th century commentator, okay? Just like they both mention that Jesus resurrected in a miraculous fashion. So in my mind, what's more difficult for God to do? To resurrect someone from the dead, or to get, to have a woman conceive a child through a miraculous act? To me, one is not anymore. If you can do one, you can do the other, right? And people who deny the virgin birth, what else do they have to deny? Well, yeah, because if you're denying it as a miracle, then, you have no business believing in the resurrection either. All right. So let's see. Okay, so Joseph is told by the angel that Mary has conceived by the power of God, and he will name the child Jesus. And as you see by the notes, the term Jesus is the Greek form of the Hebrew name Joshua. And the Hebrew name Joshua means the Lord is salvation. Like Mary, Joseph believed the angel and followed through in obedience. Boy, that pattern always comes back over and over and over again. You believe, you obey. You believe, you obey. Always like that. So she accepts to be pregnant and have the baby. He accepts her pregnancy and prepares to be the father by providing her his name and a home to live in. In Luke 1:25, it says, he kept her a virgin until she had a son. This means that after she had Jesus, he no longer kept her a virgin, and this explains the sons and the daughters spoken of in other passages. At least 4 brothers and 2 sisters. We read about that in Mark chapter 6, verse 3. So basically, Jesus is the eldest of 7 that we know of, 7 that are mentioned. 8th event, the birth of Jesus. Luke chapter 2, verse 1 to 7. Something interesting about this. Isn't it interesting that the world places so much importance on the birth of Jesus? I read in the paper today that stores are already putting out their Christmas merchandise. I mean, really. I thought they were going, they were over the top when they did it, like around Thanksgiving, but man, it's coming out now. It's amazing. They're putting it. So my point is, the world puts so much emphasis on the birth of Jesus, but only one writer describes it. The birth of Jesus is only described by one of the four writers. So Jesus was conceived while Mary was betrothed to Joseph, legally married but not yet living together. He was born in Bethlehem, the city of David, according to prophecy, Micah chapter 5, verse 2. The actual giving of names in long-distance prophecy is very rare. Very rare. Long-distance I don't mean like, 10 years tomorrow, 50 years, but in long centuries in the future, very rare that the prophets use names. The actual giving of names in long-distance prophecy is very rare, but Micah, the prophet, actually gives the name of the city where the Messiah will be born. Micah chapter 5, verse 2. And the reason historically was that there was a census, and you had to go to your native city to be counted. And Joseph, as we learned through the genealogy, was of the house of David, and probably owned a small plot of land, and so had to be there for counting purposes. That's how the Jews decided where you could own land, because the tribes had been divided, geographically. All right? Number 9. Now we get into some interesting stuff. Angels announce Jesus' birth.
Jimmy.
Luke 2, 8-20. Now historians tell us that shepherds had their flocks out grazing between March and November. So the time of Jesus' birth is somewhere between March and November. It's a long story about how December 25th was arbitrarily chosen at one time, but we're really going to stick to, the events on the Bible here. Try not to go in too many directions here. Now, that shepherds are the first to know is unusual. This is a more interesting idea than, Christmas on the 25th of December, which is another story altogether. They were the first to know because they were poor and unimportant. Why would that count? Anybody know? Yeah. And what's the best example of that? I'm sorry, I didn't hear. Yeah, shepherds are common people. And what's the best example of Jesus using lowly people to accomplish his will? The apostles, but you go before that. We've got an example right here. Jesus is born into whose household? Yeah, a young maiden, simple. Joseph's a carpenter, working class people. They were not part of the religious establishment. The shepherds were not. They were, however, symbolic of the type of Messiah Jesus was and representative of the nation of Israel. And so the shepherds represent those who come and worship the new Messiah from his people. Next event, circumcision of Jesus, Luke chapter 2, verses 21 to 38. Now here's where it gets interesting when you follow the timeline. Being devout Jews, Mary and Joseph take Jesus to Jerusalem. By the way, from Bethlehem to Jerusalem, 5 to 6 miles, not far. They take him in order to have him circumcised. How many days? Anybody know? Anybody remember? After the birth? 8 days. 8 days. That was the law. 8 days. So she has the baby. She has time to rest and, and feed him and so on and so forth. And then they're off to Jerusalem to have him circumcised. A month later, they return. 33 days later for a purification rite. Because the law said that after a woman had a baby, a month later, she was to go and have a purification rite. And you could offer 2 turtle doves if you were too poor to offer a lamb, and that's what they did. That's what Mary and Joseph did. They were poor. And it was at this time that they met who? Simeon and who else? And Anna. And tell me, what is the significance of meeting those two? Okay. Yes, that is correct. It isn't complete. There's another piece to that. Okay. Yes, that was fulfilling a promise to Simeon that God had made to him. But I want you to imagine for a moment that you're Mary or Joseph, okay? And you've conceived in a miraculous way, and you've learned through a dream that your wife is conceived in a miraculous way, and this child is going to be the Messiah. Who else knows about this? So, you have the pregnancy, and the pregnancy is the pregnancy, morning sickness and this and that, whatever, and so on and so forth, and you have the baby, and, having a baby is having a baby. Nothing has changed. It doesn't say that it wasn't without pain or distress or whatever, and then you feed the baby, and you get back into your routine, and have the baby circumcised, and then a month later you go back to the temple and do all your religious stuff, and then you start saying to yourself, did this really happen? I mean, you understand what I'm saying? They're human beings. They're thinking, wait a minute, is it just me? Am I just imagining this? And so Simeon and Anna confirm to Mary and Joseph, no, you're not dreaming. This is not just in your mind. This is of God. This is really happening. God takes care of every single angle, emotionally, spiritually, prophetically, for Mary and Joseph. When in Hebrews he says he learned obedience, where do you think he learned it? All right, some lessons. Gives us a little information about Jesus, but a great deal of information about his parents. We can learn a great deal about them. Two things I just want to mention. They were true believers. Their faith cost them something, and yet they continued to believe. I've always said it, and I'll say it again. There is no faith without risk. No faith without risk. If it's a sure thing, there's no faith involved. And that's for anything. That's relationships, church projects, stepping out. If there's no risk, there's no faith involved. I mean, that's okay. Sometimes there is no risk involved. That doesn't mean we have to be on the edge all the time. But when we're talking about faith, there's always the element of risk there. And sometimes people say, well, I don't, I want to be sure. Well, sometimes you can't be sure. Sometimes you have to, take the step. Can you imagine their life, what it was like? And then secondly, they believed despite their lack of understanding. They continued to believe even though the events were unfolding around them. We believe based on a complete story. We have the complete story, the beginning and the end. Now, we don't have the end of our story, but these people, they didn't know the end of the story. Things were just happening, as they were living. They didn't know the end, but they trusted the Lord day by day by day. Some things in our life are like that. We need to trust and obey even though the things are not fully worked out yet. Some things just take time to work out in our lives. Those are the moments when our faith is truly tested and formed in the crucible of not knowing the end. All right, that's it. That's the first 15 events. Thank you for your attention.
Now we have seen the first boyhood of Jesus Christ from 0 age to 12, and under that aspect of lecture we see about 15 incident or event that happen one at a time. We talk about the general introduction of the coming of Jesus by these two passages that we are looking at, the Luke chapter 1 verse 1 to 4, and also John chapter 1 verse 1 to 15, which precisely deals with exactly what people need to know about the coming of Jesus Christ. In Luke chapter 1 verse 1, It says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So that is where we can testify that these were men from the original people. So in verse 4 says, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. We have been taught about Jesus Christ, but the certainty and the reality of it could be found in the Word. When you look at John again, John is talking about in the beginning was the Word, which is the Jesus, talking about Jesus' childhood. He was there in the beginning, and it was through him. And verse 2 says, he was with God, and the Word was with him. Verse 3 says, through him all things were made. Without him nothing was being made. Verse 15, John testified concerning him. He cries out, saying, this was he of whom I said, when Jesus came for the baptism. Now, these are many things we can talk about. The issue of the birth of Jesus was the issue of John the Baptist. He talks about Jesus was announced his birth. Mary visited Elizabeth before the issue of the birth of John the Baptist. The birth of John the Baptist came. The angels appeared before Joseph, even when Joseph was trying to deny Mary's pregnancy, even though he wasn't the one, but he was trying to disappear. But you see, all these events happen for a reason. The birth of Jesus came, the angels announced Jesus' birth. Even John the Baptist was talking about his coming. And then we talk about Christ was circumcised after his birth, and we heard from him. He talks about 8 days before during the 8 days after which the circumcision was done. There are 15 points that he discussed about it. I would like you as individual to pick 1 or 2 points, even three, and discuss the significance of those events within the childhood of Jesus or the boyhood of Jesus that will give us the impact of whatever we think we know about Jesus Christ. Thank you for being part of this third lesson, hour of our lesson in this week 10. Hope to see you next week in in the 11th week of our semester. God bless you and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
Allah Akbar is turning things around. Allah Akbar is turning